So good evening to everyone. My name is Nancy McColm, and I'm one of the librarians here in Chelmsford. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. For those of you tuning into these talks for the first time, our presenter, Jane Oneaill, has been presenting Art Talks online for us for about 2 years now. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Courier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her nonprofit, Culturally Curious, has a mission to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. Tonight's talk will be about Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli was a leading artist of the early Italian Renaissance with a distinctive linear style. This talk will focus on how his explorations of beauty and myth dramatically shift after the rise of the religious leaders Savonarola, and his Bonfire of the Vanities. Please send any questions that you have for Jane to the chat, and she will answer those at the end of the program. So thank you all again, and here is Jane.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who is tuning in tonight for sharing your evening with me. I am very humbled and honored that you chose to do so. We are in for a treat because we are going to be looking at some incredible masterworks from the Italian Renaissance without having to spend money on a plane ticket and travel to Italy and risk getting COVID. So sit back and relax. I hope you have a glass of wine with you because Botticelli delivers in every way. So we will be looking at the work of this early Renaissance Italian master tonight. And we'll be considering what makes it unusual, what makes it confounding, exceptional, and enduring. And as was mentioned, we'll also consider how and why Botticelli's work changes towards the end of his life because of this great religious upheaval of the Bonfire of the Vanities. So there's a lot to dive into. We'll certainly be looking at this beautiful face again along the way. But let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together. We're going to start off with a quick introduction to the artist, the life and times of Sandro Botticelli, and then we'll turn our attention to his early religious works. And surprise, he has paintings at the Sistine Chapel too. And then turn around and take a look at a section called Beauty and Virtue. I really wanted to call it Blonde Bombshells, but you get the idea. We're going to be looking at some of the most beautiful women he ever painted, including this trio over here. We'll spend a little more time with them and then turn our attention to the reaction against such paintings, the Bonfire of the Vanities. So lots to cover. Let's get started with an intro to the artist. Who was Sandro Botticelli? Well, we are looking at a purported self-portrait of the artist right here. You can see he included himself right here on the edge, as though he is witness to the birth of Christ over here. This was a pretty typical thing to do at the time to show contemporary figures witnessing or going to visit Christ just after his birth. And oftentimes artists portray themselves in these paintings looking out directly at us, the viewer. And young Botticelli here looks incredibly confident, doesn't he? And rightfully so, because his career was just taking off. He was about 30 years old when he painted this painting called The Adoration of the Magi. Like so many of the other works that we'll be seeing tonight, it's in the collection of the Uffizi Gallery in Italy. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, a few important things to know about Botticelli is that he never married, and he spent his entire life living with his family right in the city of Florence. Here's a bird's eye view of the city of Florence created by another artist, but during Botticelli's lifetime. It's a good reminder of how densely packed this city was, but also how incredibly vibrant it was as well. Florence at this time, at the middle to the late 1400s, was really kind of the seat of this rebirth, this flowering of artistic, intellectual, humanistic, and scientific thinking. This was where the Renaissance was launched. It's like living in Silicon Valley at the beginning of the tech bubble. So many incredible things happening, so many great thinkers in one small space. Now, we don't know exactly what year Botticelli was born. It was somewhere around 1444. He lived until 1510, lived to about the age of 65. But you could say he was born at the right time, because he's so close to really all the most important things that are happening here. And when we're thinking about the Renaissance, one of the most important things for us to keep in mind, at least in terms of influences for a young artist like Sandro Botticelli, is this notion of this renewed interest in the classical past. So if it's roughly 1450, 1475, that means artists and individuals, almost the entire city of Florence and Rome and other parts of Italy, they're all suddenly newly interested in Italy's past, things that happened roughly 1500 years earlier. So they're literally digging up history. They're excavating sculptures and monuments, sarcophagi, this sort of thing. And they're using these incredible sculptural fragments to punctuate their gardens and create their own little collections here. But you can see from these prints made in the early 1500s, there's this interest in the sculptures that show anatomy, whether it's through nudes or through this kind of wet drapery technique that we'll see. And certainly this sort of artwork influences Botticelli so much. The other aspect of the Renaissance and this renewed interest in the classical past is this idea that Botticelli and his contemporaries were suddenly appreciating structures, monuments, things that had been built 1500 years earlier or even beyond that, things that had just become a part of the noise in these densely packed cities. These are two views of Rome. This is the Arch of Titus and the Arch of Constantine, which show that they were in these kind of densely packed areas. Contemporary buildings were being built right up alongside them. And the arches themselves are, have plants growing out of them and they're falling into disrepair. They don't look anything like the way we think of them today, perfectly preserved and kind of sitting in this splendid isolation. This is only just the beginning of artists and others looking at these ancient monuments with this new respect. And this will certainly also influence Botticelli's work. Now, another huge influencer for Sandro Botticelli is his own master, his teacher, his artistic mentor. And this is a self-portrait of that man. His name was Fra Filippo Lippi. I just love that name. It just rolls off the tongue. And he was quite a character in his own right. I mentioned he's Fra. He was a priest. Like so many artists of this time, it was so important to know the stories of the church to be able to communicate these important lessons in their artwork. It made sense to sort of first become a member of the church and then to apply your artistic skills. Botticelli was never a priest himself, but certainly he studied under one. So Fra Filippo Lippi gives him the basics, the foundation for his artistic training, and really schools him in things like linear perspective and really successful formulas like you see over here, because this is a great example of Fra Filippo Lippi's work, where we see a beautiful depiction of the Madonna painted around 1460, 1465. And here she is accompanied by the Christ child, who's being supported by these two angels, one of whom is looking over his shoulder directly at us, engaging us in this picture. And look at how Fra Filippo Lippi even paints this frame to make it look like the Virgin is actually occupying our space. This is such an intimate picture. It's really remarkable that way. And Botticelli is going to be borrowing all these lessons from his master, as we'll see as we look at his work. Now, once Botticelli becomes an artist in his own right, he's no longer an apprentice to anyone else. One of his first commissions, generally considered to be his great masterwork really of the 1470s is this painting that we see here. It was part of a whole series of depictions of virtues, female figures that are standing in for characteristics that were considered admirable. And in this case, Botticelli only got to paint one of those virtues, and the virtue is fortitude. You probably wouldn't guess that just by looking at her. She certainly looks kind of tough. She's wearing some armor, even though it's mixed with this beautiful red fur-lined cape here, but she kind of looks resigned, doesn't she? She looks like she's seen a few things. She doesn't necessarily look as tough as one might think when you're thinking of fortitude. Now, everything about this picture helps to secure Botticelli's reputation. It's hanging in a public place. It's well received. And so he's doing quite well. I wanted to share this image with you just to show you how closely he's still working within the formula, the framework of religious painting at this time. So even though this is a depiction of a virtue and it's supposed to teach a moral, it's not a religious painting per se, but look at how close it is even to a Gothic depiction of Mary and the Christ child. This dates to roughly 1300. So almost 200 years earlier. This is painted by the Italian master Duccio. Now in this picture, we see the Virgin Mary with the Christ child on her lap, and she is sitting in this throne that Duccio is trying to tell us is three-dimensional, that's projecting into our space. Botticelli is using the exact same formula to try and convey a three-dimensional space in his picture. The Virgin here is functioning as a throne herself for the Christ child. So he gives her this long torso, sort of a short lap here. And you can see that fortitude has very similar proportions, an incredibly long torso and kind of a short lap. And instead of having the Christ child there, she is holding a scepter on this side. But notice too that the angle of the head and how it comes away from the neck is so similar, this sort of downturned head turning away from the viewer in this case. So that strange sort of enigmatic facial expression that we saw in Fortitude is really coming out of religious painting. Now, one quick fun detail here, the armor that Fortitude is wearing. As we zoom in, we can see there's this incredible amount of detail. There's this great shine to it. Apparently, Botticelli apprenticed with a goldsmith, which is why we get these wonderful flourishes. That could be also where he got his nickname, Botticelli, because that's not his given name at birth. The other theory out there is that it was actually his brother's nickname. It translates to small barrel. So somebody somewhere along the way was sort of short and stout. All right, so I wanted to quickly share with you one anachronistic picture, but it sets the stage for so many of the things that we'll be seeing. We are looking at an imagined view of Botticelli in his studio in Florence in the 1400s. This painting was done in 1922 by an English artist named Eleanor Brickdale. And in this picture, her imagined Botticelli is interacting with the Medici family, the all-powerful family in Florence at the time. We're not going to talk too much about patronage today, but I think it is important to know that, that Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was a great humanist scholar in his own right. He was a poet, he loved the arts, and here he is, this de facto ruler of the city, and he loved Botticelli. He kind of took him under his wing as his favorite artist, and then later did the same for Michelangelo. So if Lorenzo the Magnificent likes you, your career is kind of set. We'll be touching on some other elements of this painting a little bit later on, but we'll wrap up on this intro to Botticelli and his life and times with this view of the Uffizi Gallery. So if you've never been to Italy, or you're still dying to go, you've probably heard of the Uffizi at one point or another. together. It's right in Florence. It contains some of the greatest masterworks of Italian art, including dozens of paintings by Botticelli himself. And I think it's just so amazing that like a stone's throw away from where this artist grew up and spent his entire life, you can still go and see so many of his paintings that have been preserved there. So, so that gives us sort of a quick primer on Botticelli. Let's turn our attention now to his religious works and get a good understanding in terms of what he was producing before we get into the blonde bombshells that create this huge reaction against him. All right, so to get started, Botticelli was painting great religious pictures that told great moral lessons all along the way. This was the bread and butter of what early Renaissance artists were doing. Their primary patrons were, of course, the church. So in this case, we are looking at an altarpiece named Palla di Sant'Ambrogio. And this kind of painting is known as a Sacra Conversazione, otherwise known as a sacred conversation. This was painted in 1470. And unless I mention otherwise, almost all of these works are tempera and they're located at the Uffizi. So it's a large painting. It's about 5 feet tall. So the figures are just under life size. Notice that he has created this rational space for them using linear perspective. It looks like a room that you could realistically step right into. And in this room, we see the Madonna, Mary, enthroned with the Christ child on her lap. He is plump and delicious, looking right out at us, seemingly blessing us. Her face is downturned, sort of like fortitude that we saw before. She's surrounded by saints, Mary, John the Baptist, St. Francis of Assisi, and St. Catherine over here. And there's some patron saints in the foreground, some of whom, or one of whom, is looking right out at us, drawing us into this picture. So we have this imagined gathering of these divine figures, and who they are, which ones were selected, are really usually related to the patron, what they prefer. And in this case, and in almost all cases, the patron is related to the Medici family. So these patron saints in particular are sort of like their favorite patron saints. Now, as Botticelli's career is moving along and really cooking, you can tell, you can see with this transition that his work becomes even more elegant and much more elaborate. So we've gone from just a few saints to a bevy of saints in the foreground. Madonna and Christ child still central, still enthroned, but they're really up on a pedestal now. And even the architecture surrounding them is much more elaborate. She is in this little sort of niche with these projecting pilasters here. There's a dome over her head with a scallop shell reinforcing this this very delicate halo that encircles her head. Just on her level here, there are 4 angels with wings, and they are holding the different instruments of Christ's torture and death. So she has this kind of sad look on her face, and it's because she knows that she will eventually lose her son to this crucifixion. So once again, she's elegant, she's gorgeous. She's got this very long neck with her head sort of hinged in this unusual direction. The saints themselves seem more three-dimensional, more sculptural. They all have these incredible sort of individualized gestures, but take a look at Saint John over here. He is incredibly elongated and a little bit distorted, and we'll see these unusual distortions in Botticelli's work along the way. So one last sacred conversation that we're going to look at shows that even throughout his career, he's not always adding saints. Sometimes he's just paring down the figures, but focusing his attention on the setting. So this is known as the Bardi altarpiece. It's from 1484, and this is at a museum in Berlin. And what we see here are just 2 saints, John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. We have the Madonna and Christ child enthroned at the center with this kind of projecting throne here, again, to create that illusion of a 3-dimensional space, a window onto another world. The Madonna is just about to feed the Christ child. And so he's not blessing us, but he is seemingly still aware of our presence. Now, Botticelli has focused pretty much all of his attention in this painting to the natural world the plants, the leaves, the grasses here, and they're all varied throughout. It's as though he took some sort of botany class and really wanted to show off. So he's created these kind of faux architectural niches for each one of these saints to reinforce sort of their separateness from each other, but also kind of subtly reinforce those halos as well. So, so the natural world is sort of coalescing with the religious one in this case. But if you have good eyesight, I mean, take a look at all these different plants that are on the ground here just below the throne. It's really quite impressive. Now, in addition to the sacred conversations, Botticelli painted a number of Annunciation scenes, and I just love a good Annunciation scene. I always love to see how male artists kind of imagine that Mary might react to the news that she is divinely pregnant as a virgin and carrying the Son of God. It seems like a pretty dramatic moment. So, so artists handle it very differently over the centuries. And in this case, we are looking at Botticelli's painting. This one is from 1481. It's 20 feet long, and it's actually a fresco painting. So this is a little bit different from his other works that were tempera, that have more vivid colors. Fresco painting is when an artist applies their pigment directly into wet plaster, so it becomes a permanent part of the wall. And for that reason, the colors tend to be a little bit more muted. So in this big expanse of fresco, we have this interesting scenario where Mary is in a contemporary Renaissance palace, and the Archangel Gabriel is flying in to deliver this news of her pregnancy. He's got his wings, he's hovering over the ground here, and he's got a white flower signifying her purity. His arms are crossed across his chest. Now, the message is from God, which is sort of emanating from this doorway behind him, but it goes through the angel, and it's as though it gets to sort of reinterpret it, and it goes all the way to Mary. Now, I love Mary's pose here. Doesn't it almost look like she is holding an invisible child in this moment? She is most likely about to cross her own arms over her chest, receiving this news. But Botticelli, this is just sort of the first hint at it, becomes really a master in creating these dynamic relationships just based out of gestures and poses. And I think you can really see it in this next and last Annunciation scene that I'm going to show you. This is from 1490. He's sort of at the height of his powers. It's a much smaller panel in this case, and it's tempera, so the colors are more vivid. So we've gone from a 20-foot long painting to about a 5-foot long painting. So all the extraneous details have sort of been removed. We don't get all the details of the palace here. It's just the figure of Gabriel and Mary. And Gabriel is not hovering off of the ground with rays of light coming out of his mouth. Instead, he's crouching here, and he just has this one hand raised towards Mary. Mary isn't sort of receiving this information humbly or even seemingly like cradling an invisible child. Instead, her arm is outstretched, her wrists are flexed. It's almost as though she's defending herself away from this news. It's almost as though it's unwelcome. But what's really going on here is that the message from God is coming through the angel's arms, through that hand, and being sort of transmitted across the air to Mary's hand. And that this detail here is just so wonderful. It's almost as though it's reinforced by the architecture just behind them. That important message that's sort of flying through the air, connecting these two figures in this sort of unusual pose of flexed wrists. Now, this is a little bit like Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel ceiling, this great detail of the creation of man, God swooping in, and Adam just about to reach his finger out too. So Botticelli, decades before Michelangelo sets foot in the Sistine Chapel, is already sort of mastering this notion of storytelling through gestures and poses. But just the mention of Michelangelo is a great segue over to the Sistine Chapel in Rome, because this is one of the few times Botticelli gets to leave Florence. And so he he goes to this other city-state called there by the Pope, who we see over on the right. And inside the Sistine Chapel, decades before Michelangelo's there, the ceiling is still just a painted starry sky. This Pope has assembled a series of leading early Italian Renaissance artists, including Perugino and Botticelli. And they are tasked with creating these massive works that are roughly 13 feet high and about 20 feet across. Just underneath it are these painted swags of drapery. So when Botticelli was there, really these large works were the show. I mean, this is what was the most important decoration at the time. And you might be asking yourself, is it still there? And in fact, it is, but nobody really cares about it anymore because Michelangelo just steals the show with his ceiling and with the Last Judgment over here on the east end of the chapel. So very quickly, I wanted to show you Botticelli's contributions to the Sistine Chapel. So if you have any trips planned in the months or years ahead, you know to keep your eye open for them. So quickly, just to give you a sense in terms of what he contributed and what his storytelling powers are like at this point in his career, because this is about a decade into his career, a decade after that painting of Fortitude. You can see that he is a highly capable artist. Now, these are fresco paintings, large scale works, huge undertakings. This image alone has more than 50 people in it. Can you imagine how long it would take you to paint something like this? Now, Botticelli is doing something in this work that is very typical of the early Italian Renaissance. He is telling three separate stories, but he does not carve up the picture into separate panels in the way that like a modern cartoon would sort of separate them out to make the storytelling really clear. In this case, he's telling these three stories about the temptation of Christ, but he shows Christ three times in just three different scenarios here. You would think that he would sort of lead with that and make it front and center, but instead what's front and center is a leper that Christ had healed who is about to go through like a cleansing ceremony, and everybody else is just kind of witnessing it. No doubt these are all people who paid to have their portraits included in this huge work here. Now, another work just across from the Temptation of Christ are scenes from the life of Moses. And once again, you can see Botticelli using the similar storytelling technique and only differentiating these scenes or making the scenes distinct by showing Moses in the same costume throughout. So I think we see him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different times in this one massive panel. And so it can be, I think, sometimes confusing to people. I'm not going to go into what all of the scenes are here because we've got, I think, more relevant works to focus on. But I think just to understand why he's painting these subjects, the temptations of Christ, the scenes of Moses, it's all to tie back to honor his patron, the Pope in this case, because when you can connect the Old Testament to the New Testament, it legitimizes the New Testament, and the New Testament in Christ legitimizes the papacy because Christ chose Peter as essentially the first Pope. And so it's a great way to sort of honor yourself if you are the Pope decorating the Sistine Chapel at this point. One last Botticelli masterwork from the Sistine Chapel here is again, interesting in terms of its storytelling, showing the same figures multiple times. But I wanted to show you this work because it honors the classical past in the way that all of these early Renaissance artists were just beginning to appreciate these ancient works. So Botticelli is working in Rome at the time. He's kicking around Rome during his downtime, and he sees monuments like the Arch of Constantine, and he includes them very literally in this work over here. And it's perfect because it's appropriate to the time of the stories that he's telling, but it's also creates this great sort of symmetrical composition. It anchors the composition in this wonderful way, and it shows this early Renaissance fascination for the antique. So now we get a sense of all of these religious paintings that he could create. Let's turn our attention to the beautiful blondes that he's so well known for. Beauty and virtue. Now, what we're going to consider here is how and why Italians thought of these beautiful depictions of the Madonna and Child as being so virtuous. Now, we already saw Fra Filippo Lippi's contribution to the art world and to religious art, and it was this absolutely stunning depiction of a Madonna and Child. Now, it's hard to believe, but this kind of naturalism that you see in Fra Filippo Lippi's work would have almost been considered almost like sacrilegious by the time we get to Botticelli and the height of his powers. So what's happening here at this point in history is this notion that to be perfectly beautiful was to be divine. So the virtue of Mary would have been conveyed through her absolute idealized beauty. So we go from something that's naturalistic, it looks like maybe the most beautiful girl at your school when you're a young person, to somebody who looks sort of ethereal and like an otherworldly beauty, with proportions that, you know, you could only get through sort of like Photoshop or a great Snapchat filter. That's what Botticelli was able to do for his patrons. And he did it on a prolific scale. There are so many bombshell Madonnas out there. In this case, this is known as the Madonna of the Book. It's from 1483, and offhand, I believe this is in Milan. So these are smaller paintings. They're more intimate in scale. These are called devotional works. People might even have them in their homes. I mean, if you wanted to pray to Madonna, if you wanted to go pray to Madonna every day, wouldn't it just be that much more rewarding if she's beautiful? I equate this, every time I look at this, I equate this to the checkout aisle at the grocery store and the magazines that have the most beautiful photoshopped depictions, the most beautiful photos of celebrities today, the kind of pictures that we can't take our eyes off of. That was what Botticelli was doing for his patrons at the time. So there, like I said, there are dozens of examples of these blonde bombshells, these virtuous blonde bombshells that he was painting, but we're going to skip to the mother of them all, pun intended. This is the Madonna of the Magnificat, and it's really, I think, the best of the best when it comes to his Madonnas. So well appreciated, even just after, in the years after it was made, that 5 contemporary copies were made. One is at the Louvre, one is at the Morgan Library in New York City. So fairly close if we wanted to see it in person. So what we're looking at here is a tondo, a round painting. I think it's roughly probably 4 or 5 feet across. And Botticelli usually painted just under life size. The year's 1481, so it's the same year he was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But we can see he has really mastered the depiction of the most beautiful kind of woman as the woman who is the mother of Christ here. Notice how she has just a little bit of pink on her cheeks, a little bit of pink in her lips, slender eyebrows here, beautiful downturned eyes. There's actual gold in her hair, as well as some of the other figures in this particular painting. But in addition to that, she's got these sort of transparent veils, a number of them on her head, this gorgeous kind of twisting pink and blue scarf that goes around her head and then crosses over her shoulders. And it seems like the perfect resting spot for this crown of heaven, this delicate star-filled crown that is about to be placed on her head. She could not be more idealized. She could not be more perfect. The little detail that I love here is that she is writing this hymn, the Magnificat, and in this case, the Christ child is kind of guiding her hand, like, oh, write this word next. I just get a little kick out of that. So, so this work is so revered that even Eleanor Brookdale included a reference to the Magnificat, the Madonna of the Magnificat, in Botticelli's studio, in that painting that we saw before. Now, I wanted to go back to this image because in this imagined scene in Botticelli's studio, you can see that there is a beautiful blonde bombshell who is walking into the room, being presented really by these Medici brothers in this case. And the woman we know historically would have been Simonetta Vespucci. And she was really the undisputed most beautiful woman in Florence, if not in all of Italy. And her beauty certainly inspired the works of Botticelli. In this case, she's being presented by Giuliano Medici, who at one point did this really sort of over the top kind of courtly love gesture, referring to her in a public, this public display of affection, sort of referring to her as the unparalleled one. And she was just so gorgeous for her time. Now, art historians love to imagine that any beautiful blonde in Botticelli's paintings is actually a depiction of Simonetta Vespucci. You might be pausing on that name. She was married into the family related to Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer for whom America is named. Florence was a small, well-connected town at this time. There are art historians too that believe that Botticelli might have had a romantic relationship or even just an unrequited love for Simonetta Vespucci. But with pictures like this that were even painted a decade after her death, there's still these art historical debates as to whether or not it's supposed to be Simonetta. Now we're kind of moving away from the virtue of the Madonna in this case. We are moving to something that is really about beauty and about sensuality, because during this time in Renaissance Italy, they believed that hair inflamed desire. And these paintings are really all about hair, aren't they? Have you ever seen hairstyles that are this elaborate, this unusual? There are braids, there are strange little ponytails, there are just twists and folds and curls every which way. And then all of this adornment as well, pearls everywhere. There were actually laws at the time, sumptuary laws that prohibited women of lower classes from using too many ribbons and pearls in their hair. So it's interesting to think in portrait busts like this, even if they're imagined or idealized or posthumous portraits of Simonetta Vespucci, that whoever had modeled for Botticelli had gone to a stylist that day. You know, they were looking their absolute best. And the hair was certainly supposed to suggest their sensuality, their sexuality. Notice in this case that she's got these double braids that come around and terminate right there in between her breasts. So all of this is supposed to be almost as good as looking at a nude woman. And really, that's the direction that Botticelli is going to. He's moved away from these virtuous Madonnas, and now it's about the beauty, it's about the blondes, and oftentimes it is about sex. So we are moving into a whole nother realm here, where Botticelli takes on these huge mythological paintings that were really unprecedented for this time in history. The first one that he does is called Primavera, or the Allegory of Spring. This is 1482. This work is a tempera on panel, and it's roughly 6.5 feet tall by about 10 feet wide. So again, the figures are just under life size. Now, this is a really strange painting. And like I said, really nothing like it had been painted before since classical antiquity. And art historians today are still debating what's really going on here. But what's generally accepted is that this very large painting was done to commemorate, to celebrate a wedding. And so everything about it is really understood to be references to fertility and to love, romantic love, but it's all about pollination. It's all about procreation. And so I'm going to walk you through it as best I can here. As we move through it, even though these are like pagan gods that we'll be looking at, we will see along the way Botticelli is borrowing from his religious bag of tricks in the same way that he did with Fortitude, looking like a Madonna there. So right off the bat, we have front and center, not the Virgin, but Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. And she is fully clothed here. She might even look a little bit pregnant to you, but I think pear-shaped bodies were all the rage at this time. But notice the setting here. There's this beautiful arch around her, sort of isolating her from the other figures, accentuating her importance here. And it might already remind you of Botticelli's Barnby altar place that we saw before, with these elaborate architectural niches made out of foliage. Now, instead of being the Virgin with the Christ child in her lap, she is Venus. And her child, who is Eros or Cupid, is not in her arms, but floating above her, this chunky baby who's airborne here. And he's blindfolded, I should say, and using his little bow and arrow to create some havoc, wreak some chaos in somebody's love life. Now, if we move on to Venus and her pose here, we have that recognizable flexed wrist that we saw before. Botticelli uses it so in such a wonderful way here to communicate that important message. We don't necessarily know exactly what Venus is bestowing on us here, but even as I look at her, notice how her head is tilted. She's got this long neck. In so many ways, he's borrowing from the Madonnas that he's painted along the way. Now, the painting itself, it's strange in that the figures are very bright, almost as though they're spotlit on a stage. They're all really close to the front of the picture plane, but the rest of the painting is very dark. And that is because it has darkened over time. But the setting here is an orange grove. That's a reference to the Medici family, almost certainly. Medici, of course, that name kind of refers to medicine, and oranges were prized for their medicinal properties, so they were sort of symbols of the Medici family. And then down below, we've got all of these plants, these flowers. I'm going to zoom in on this for you here. I think I have a detail. Botanists and art historians have been able to definitively identify more than 130 different species of plants and flowers on the ground in this painting. I mean, Botticelli just went to town, imagining all of the different types of sort of flowering and pollination possibilities that existed in this imagined landscape that he was creating. Now, let's get back to understanding what's actually unfolding with all of the storytelling and the figures here. We're going to start over on the right with this figure grouping of 3. The first character, if we're reading from right to left in this case, is blue. That's pretty unusual. He's got blue skin and wings, and he is hovering off the ground, and his cheeks are all puffed up. He is understood to be a wind god, a zephyr. And so if you think about spring and pollination, it all really relies on the wind blowing these things around and allowing for seeds to spread. In this moment, he is pursuing this nymph, understood to be a nymph named Chloris. She is running away from him. Notice how her whole body is trying to escape him. She is nude, save for this kind of diaphanous, see-through drapery, but he has grabbed her. And in this moment, it's like he has inseminated her, because there is a plant, a flower sprouting from her mouth in this moment where she's been captured. And she certainly looks panicked about it. You know, this doesn't necessarily look like the look of love or the posture of love, but art historians generally agree that in this moment, because he has captured her, she transforms into this third figure here, and she is the goddess of flowers. She's Flora. She's got this incredible floral dress on, and notice she's no longer panicked. She's no longer trying to run away. She's striding forward confidently, serenely, spreading blossoms blossoms that she's been cradling in her dress here. Now, if we move to the other side of the painting, there are these four figures on the other side of Venus, and little Cupid up here is pointing his arrow at one of these three women. They are the three graces. They represent pleasure, chastity, and beauty. We don't really know who, but they sort of give and take. They share with each other equally. They're all bombshells. And notice the elaborate hairdos again. One theory too is that this is Simonetta Vespucci here, but who really knows? They're also wearing this diaphanous drapery, basically running around in the woods naked. This is a really strange painting in so many ways, but one of them is about to fall in love. Now, the last figure here is Mercury. He's the messenger to the gods, the Roman god of the month of May. So if this is a painting about springtime, he is exactly the right person to include. And what is he doing? He's got this little staff here, and he is like swirling up the clouds, sort of making his own mischief. So on one side of the picture is this wind god, and on the other side, there's this notion of like a little bit of wild weather. So it all comes down to like blowing seeds around and pollinating or impregnating all of the women in the center. At least that's our general understanding. So all this talk of sex and pollination leads us to Botticelli's masterwork, his greatest known mythological painting that was still revolutionary for its time. This is 1485's Birth of Venus. This is on canvas, sort of unusual for Botticelli, and it's about 5.5 feet tall by about 9 feet wide. Now, as I understand it, this depiction of Venus, once again, the goddess of love and beauty, here now nude because she was just born out of sea foam and she's being blown to shore. This is such an unusual depiction of her as a almost life-size female nude. Nothing like this had been painted for roughly 1,500 years. You can imagine it took some courage, some boldness on the part of Botticelli to create an image like this. Now, this picture was probably also painted to celebrate somebody's marriage. It has these same themes of love and pollination and that sort of thing. And certainly it's a picture about sex. It's a picture about pleasure. But really, up until this point, every time you saw a female nude in a work of art, it was Eve, and those paintings were about shame. So this is a picture that's about the joy of looking, the pleasure of sex. And so really the world, and Florence in particular, hadn't seen anything like this before. We've got another Zephyr-like figure here with big puffed up cheeks. And we've got Madonna riding this giant scallop shell, very similar to the Virgin that we saw underneath the scallop shell dome before. It's just like Botticelli just flipped it all around. And here is that angel Gabriel floating in the air with his wings, so similar to the Zephyr character, in this case, rays of light coming through him out of his mouth. And there's a little bit of wind coming out of the Zephyr character. There's a secondary female wind figure who is wrapped around Zephyr, sort of in an anatomically impossible way. But we don't question that too much because really all eyes are on Venus here. They're blowing around some roses. On the other side of Venus is another sort of lesser character. Some art historians think that it's spring, others debate that it's summer. They get all into the different kinds of flowers that are represented, but she is running to greet Venus and basically cover her up. So let's focus on Venus here because she's really the star of the show. This is, like I said, an unparalleled work of art. And just to reinforce that it's all about sex and pleasure, let's take a look at her hair because we know how important hair is in Renaissance Italy. So she has this, some curls that are blowing in the wind because of this Zephyr character. And then her hair is, this golden hair is impossibly long. If it was probably hanging, it would go past her knees, but she's kind of gathered it up to hide her pubic area here. Now she has this kind of classic Botticelli head tilt with the long neck and the head that seems sort of strangely hinged on top of it. And the more you look at her body, the more bizarre it becomes. Her shoulders are tiny and they seem to sort of collapse on her body. She has these small breasts, but really kind of large arms in comparison to that, especially large forearms, I would say. And then look at the way she is standing. Now, Italians have always loved what's called a contrapposto stance, this kind of S curve to the spine, where one leg is at work and one leg is at rest. But in this case, that shift of the hips that is the quintessential element of a contrapposto stance, it's a little bit off here. If we were to cut her in half this way, her upper body almost looks as though she's standing upright, and her lower half is looks as though she's kind of falling forward. Her supporting leg is way over here. It's kind of underneath her other shoulder. It looks as though she's about to just tip over. There's probably some good reasons for that. Botticelli was most certainly looking at sculpture when he was imagining this Venus. And there are many classical examples of Venuses in this same pose. It's called a modest Venus pose. And believe it or not, when you make Venus aware of her own nudity and she tries to cover it up, in some ways it makes it even more alluring. It heightens the awareness of the viewer that you are peeking at something that you're not supposed to be peeking at. It makes a voyeur of us all. Now, notice the skin tone here that Botticelli has painted for this Venus. It looks like marble. It has this almost coldness of marble here. It doesn't really have the warmth of flesh. And Botticelli's famous linear style, where you can see a hard black outline here, it doesn't really allow for like the softness, the fleshiness of flesh that artists like Da Vinci will master in a decade or so. Here, there is this kind of coldness that is contained within that hard black outline. The other reason why Botticelli's Venus sort of looks like she might be tipping over is that I think he was also borrowing from Gothic sculpture as well, in particular ivory carvings of the Madonna that oftentimes have this kind of Gothic swoop to them because necessarily they were carved out of ivory tusks. So they already have this curve built in. You can sort of see something similar to that with this curve of Venus's body here. Now, there's so much more to unpack with this picture, but given our time tonight, we do have to touch on the Bonfire of the Vanities and how everything changes. Okay, back to the Medicis just for a moment. These two Medici that we've been seeing throughout the program tonight, they're not uniformly popular in Florence. And there was actually a whole conspiracy to assassinate them. Giuliano was successfully assassinated. This is a posthumous portrait of him painted by Botticelli. Lorenzo the Magnificent escapes assassination, but he leads with this uncertainty over the next decade. There are all these revolts, and then eventually he goes into exile, leaving this power vacuum in Florence. And who comes into the void but this priest, this Dominican friar named Fra Girolamo Savonarola. And he's an extremist. He's like a hellfire preacher, and he condemns worldliness and the corruption of the city. He is obsessed with austerity and human wickedness. Now, the next few images I'm going to show you are not necessarily contemporary images of Savonarola, but they give us a sense in terms of how he was thought of during his lifetime. This is an image of him preaching. This is not done by Botticelli. But Savonarola was somebody who disapproved in the extreme of frivolity, of poems, of sex, of paintings, of mirrors. And so he called people to come together and bring those things and actually burn them. So, so over here in this little relief carving, you can see Savonarola, you can see the big flames. These would be huge events where people would come down with books, with paintings, with their mirrors, and throw everything into a fire. Here's another depiction of Savonarola preaching, and his followers, who were referred to as weepers, would kind of force the hands of people who weren't even followers of Savonarola. You can see these people don't necessarily want to be there, but I think their possessions have been taken from them and have been included in what will be burned. Now, supposedly, even some Botticelli works were burned. And you could imagine works like The Birth of Venus and Primavera would be first on the chopping block, because those are paintings about pleasure, about sex. This would be exactly what Savonarola was against. Now, Savonarola, he was a little too hot to handle. And when you are preaching against corruption, well, people in power take notice. And so he was brought to trial for a number of religious offenses, and he was sentenced to death. He was just 45 years old. And so here's a painting, again, not by Botticelli, showing Savonarola's death. He was hanged on a cross and then burnt alive in the public square in Florence. And so almost certainly Botticelli was there. Now, did Botticelli subscribe to Savonarola's religious teachings, this upheaval that really took over all of Florence at the time? Well, let me offer up what he began to paint after Savonarola came to power, and even after Savonarola's death. We're so lucky because here in New England, we have a great example of a late Botticelli. This is right in the Gardner Museum. It's a much smaller work. You can see here, it's about the size of one of these Italian boxes called cassones. This was also probably a wedding painting, a wedding gift. And it's called The Tragedy of Lucretia. It dates to roughly 1500, just a year or two after Savonarola was sentenced to death. So what we see here is a storytelling in three parts, sort of like what we saw at the Sistine Chapel. And once again, we have Botticelli using these classical monuments to kind of anchor his composition. But he's telling us the story, the tragedy of Lucretia. It starts here, it goes all the way over here, and then it ends in the center. So what happens? Well, Lucretia is a virtuous woman, and one night while her husband is away, she is raped by the son of the king. Notice he has a little dagger here. She resists, and then her husband finds her unconscious. When she comes to, she does what a virtuous woman is supposed to do in this situation. She kills herself. Of course, I'm saying this sarcastically. And then in the end, we see her dead body, and the men of Rome are so overcome by her death that they are going to rise up and overthrow the king. Now, this is all so different than Botticelli's other paintings. Gone are the beautiful Madonnas. Gone are the blonde bombshells. These are tiny, acidic, agitated characters that are going to teach you a moral lesson like you have never seen. Imagine getting a story like this, a painting like this, as a wedding present. And it's not the only one that he painted. He also painted the story of Virginia, which is very similar. We've got Virginia in a green dress with a pink coat. Virginia was a married woman who was violated. So she is brought before this judge. The judge says that he's going to make her his slave. Her family, in particular, her father, kidnaps her and rescues her away. But because of all of this that has happened to her, he's ashamed of her, wants to protect her honor, so he kills her. So once again, we have another dead woman, and that is supposed to be the virtuous thing. And this was given to somebody as a wedding present. Once again, the figures are tiny. They're fighting with each other. They're acidic. There is no pleasure here. There are no gorgeous figures. There's certainly no nude bodies. When Botticelli is painting images of the birth of Christ, which is, one of the favorite stories for early Italian Renaissance artists, the story is overtaken by all of these animated, almost agitated angels throughout. There's like 24 of them. There are even these tiny little devils crawling in and out of the rocks down here. And at the top, he's even quoting Revelations. So even though he's depicted the birth of Jesus or the nativity here, his mind is on the end of times. Savonarola's influence is creeping into every aspect of his painting. Even when it comes, oh, and then just the quick comparison here, when, decades earlier, when he's painting an image of the Christ child and the adoration of the Magi, there's no such frenetic activity. It's a calm scene. There's stasis here. Now, even when he gets to painting Madonnas after Savonarola, it's not about how idealized they are. She's still beautiful, but she looks more like a regular person now. And she's looking right out at us. There's a directness here that sort of takes away from that idealization that we saw with works like the Madonna of the Magnificat. Instead, it's like we're going back to a little bit of that naturalism that would have been considered almost inappropriate a decade or so earlier in Botticelli's career. So we'll end with this one of his last works called The Man of Sorrows. It dates to roughly 1510, which is the year that Botticelli died. This is in a private collection. And so here we're looking at like an imagined portrait of Jesus after his crucifixion. We can see the wounds of the cross still on his hands. He's bound. He's got the crown of thorns and blood on his face. He's got this morose expression on as well. Images like this have always been about emphasizing Christ's suffering, the infliction of pain on his human body. In this case, he's got this circle of these little angels behind his head. It's like a halo of angels, and they all have the instruments of his torture behind him. So this is much darker stuff than Botticelli was painting. And it might come as no surprise that there are a number of art historians that say that Botticelli's work was just out of line with what the public wanted by the end of his life. And he apparently died virtually penniless and unknown because essentially the religious extremism had taken him in an entirely different direction than where the rest of Florence and Italy were going. So what about his legacy? Where do things go from here? Well, we know that his legacy today is as strong as ever. People still love Botticelli's work. One of Frida Kahlo's early self-portraits, she painted herself with an incredibly long neck and this graceful hand, and she referred to herself as being like a Botticelli here. She's even got the waves in the background. Maybe she's her own Birth of Venus here. The surrealist master Rene Magritte borrows figures from Botticelli wholesale, and then the Birth of Venus is featured on European money. Is there any sort of higher status than that? It's like she's royalty practically. These days, we still consider Botticelli's blondes some of the most beautiful the world has ever seen. So, we're still trying to get tips for, accomplishing these same kinds of curls that Botticelli was able to convey hundreds of years ago. His stock is still really high in the art world. Just last year, this painting sold for almost $92 million. This is, I should mention, not a self-portrait. Sorry to skip around there. Not a self-portrait, but a portrait of a young man here. And it's an unusually high price for an old master work. These days, climate activists are using works like famous works by Botticelli to get attention for their cause. So in this case, these two activists actually glued their hands to the glass covering Botticelli's painting. They were, of course, removed, and the painting wasn't damaged at all. But it's a really good way to land in the news and try to get your message amplified. And then if you feel like you need more Botticelli in your life, I've got good news for you. You don't have to renew your passport. You can just go to Minneapolis, because starting next month, there's going to be an epic show there with dozens of loans from the Uffizi Museum, and I'm sure including some of the works that we saw tonight. So just to wrap up, really, Botticelli is this critical step in the history of art, taking us from this Gothic past to the high Renaissance, really, that hard linear style that he uses is sort of gives way to the softness of the shading of artists like Da Vinci over here. But these poses and the facial expressions and the compositions, they're really rooted in this Gothic past. But Botticelli does this phenomenal job of updating them and making them this absolutely enduring beauty. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about the works that we saw this evening. I'll start looking at the chat here too. I see Catherine Hunter raised her hand. Maybe we can take her off mute. Or maybe you can. All right, we've got a couple of raised hands here. Elaine, I'm going to allow you to talk if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. All right. So maybe Elaine couldn't do that, but I'm looking at the Q&A now. Diane asked, what does the cross at the center of the floor symbolize? I think she is looking back at the altar piece here that we saw right down here. And she says, this is the painting of Mary and the baby, red and nurse with the two Johns and the background scenery. So why is there the cross at the center of the floor? This is a great question. And believe it or not, the references to Christ's crucifixion are abundant in images of the Christ child. Usually they're not quite as overt as this. Oftentimes he's holding a pomegranate, and the pomegranate has, you know, the red inside. So it's like a reference to the spilling of his blood. And that's oftentimes why Mary looks so morose in paintings of the Madonna and Child, is because she knows what's going to happen to her son. So even when it's a depiction of Christ as an infant, it is supposed to, it's oftentimes intended to reference his ultimate death, his untimely death. So it is kind of strange, though, to have an image of the crucifixion just front and center like that when it's a picture of the Christ child. So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Let's see here. And Catherine says, let's see if I can get you unmuted here too. Catherine, you, let's see.
Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, just a really wonderful program. And I must say, I haven't looked at Botticelli in a while. And I remember how beautiful the women are. Beautiful, beautiful nature. But one thing has struck me this time, whether you're looking at the Birth of Venus or the image you have up right now, I almost feel like the individual figures are photoshopped into the setting. Are the men really standing on the ground? Do all the crowds, people really fit? Can you describe what this stage is of composition that do you have that reaction, or is it, am I alone?
I can totally see what you're saying here. So, it's like they're not fully integrated into the scenes.
Right.
And I think you can definitely see that in like Primavera, the allegory of spring too. It's almost as though they're like almost hovering on a stage. And even when I look at like the feet of John the Baptist here, you have this kind of quasi Gothic painting trope where the feet almost look like they're downturned a little bit. It almost looks as though the figure is like hovering above the ground as opposed to like rooted on solid earth. And so they don't seem fully integrated into their surroundings. I think that this is a remarkable eye for detail, Catherine. I'm really glad that you mentioned it. And I think you're spot on. It's like it is almost like they've been copied and pasted into the settings. But artists like Botticelli were kind of cranking out these images too. And so he had his own apprentices. And so as a master, he would have been the person probably painting the faces and hands for a lot of these paintings. And his students might have been doing the bodies, some of the drapery, maybe some of the feet in some cases too. So so it's interesting to think about how multiple people worked on these things, and maybe that's what could possibly contribute to that feeling too. But I think you're spot on in your assessment there. They don't really fully seem integrated into the spaces or the settings.
You know, I think the detail is just so magnificent that you just ignore that. And somehow that caught my eye this time. The other thing I was going to ask about too is when you have the group scene and you notice one of the characters looking at you, I almost feel like it's the influence of Norman Rockwell, where he has people, you know, Botticelli influenced artists now. And I feel like there's a little bit of Norman Rockwell has adopted some tricks from or details from Botticelli, or even Wyatt, the sort of alabaster kind of skin color that, you know, you see those details more. And your slides are beautiful. You have very good quality images. So thank you for that also.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's this lesson that has been passed on through, you know, down through the centuries, really. If you have a figure that's looking out directly at you, certainly it's going to pull you in a little bit more. And it's interesting to think about how Botticelli plays with this, even just knowing that, like, the appropriate trope for the time is to have Mary looking sort of forlorn, you know, downcast eyes. It's interesting that she's looking out at us directly, that the Christ child is here too. So always the exchange of glances, the gestures, the poses, it's always just fascinating to me. So I'm glad that you raised some of those elements in your comments, Catherine. I think I saw a question before about some of these, the transparent veils and the golden crowns. Well, as I mentioned before, Botticelli had apprenticed with a goldsmith. So that's why he's really able to, I mean, he's literally putting gold in the paintings to make these crowns that are just so spectacular. And clearly he's come up with this kind of style, this solution to create something that looks like it's transparent, with all of these diaphanous robes. Even the angel Gabriel has one that's sort of kind of flying around him here. They're really just spectacular, right? And once you really start appreciating them, it's hard to take your eye off of them. But it's really just using, I mean, for the most part, like little flourishes of white paint here. So that's me minimizing it in some ways, but I think that's really what it comes down to. So they are spectacular in any event. Let's see if I can find any more questions here. Any significance to the colors that Botticelli used on clothes the Madonna is wearing? That's a great question. For the most part, Madonna is shown with blue robes and a red dress underneath that. And that has been pretty typical in the history of art, probably for centuries before this. So, so he's not really deviating from models that came before. Even if we look back at that Duccio painting from like 1311, it's the same sort of thing. So there's kind of like a standard costume for the Madonna, and he's not doing anything revolutionary there, just kind of sticking with the tradition. Gail asked, but isn't that because his use of hard edges set each person into their own individual space instead of becoming part of the painting by shadows and soft edges? Gail, well, I think you just hit the nail on the head with that. You found words for something that hadn't even connected in my brain yet, but that linear style that we talked about, going back to, you know, the birth of Venus, seeing that hard outline to everything. The hard outline is really what makes it look like all of these figures are a little bit photoshopped, not fully integrated into their settings. It makes for that copy paste kind of feel to so many of these works. Gail, excellent comment. I'm glad you shared it. All right. I think that gets to all of the questions. I really appreciate the kind words that I'm seeing in the chat. Every comment means so much to me here, so thank you. And maybe one last person asking a question. Let's see. Is it Catherine Cantrell? Catherine, would you like to ask a question? I think if you unmute yourself, you could contribute if you'd like. Okay, maybe I got that wrong. Well, I think we've answered most of the questions. As always, I really appreciate all of you spending your evening with me. I'll be back again for another talk next month for the Chelmsford Library, and that presentation will be on Cindy Sherman. It's like the perfect talk for like the season of Halloween, because she's an artist, contemporary artist, who uses makeup, costumes, props, and sometimes prosthetics to recreate herself in photographs. She's like the original queen of the selfie. So really, really fascinating images, and we'll have a lot of fun with that one. So I hope you can join us. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or corrections for me, please feel free to reach out to me on my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. I just put that in the chat. And I have a calendar page on my website too, with some other upcoming virtual programs that you can attend for free. So thank you for coming tonight, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much, everybody.
Oh, thanks, Stan. That was great. I'm off camera here a little bit, but that was the first one I got to watch the whole way through, so it was really interesting. Enjoyed it.
Well, have a great night.
Okay, thanks. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.